Have you ever walked into a room and felt small, not because of your size, but because of the way people looked at you? Or didn't, that quiet moment when you realize they've already decided who you are before you've said a word? That's exactly how 10-year-old Malcolm and Miles felt the first time they stepped into their new karate dojo. Two identical twins, black, soft-spoken, new to town, and in a space built on discipline and respect, they became invisible before they could even bow. This isn't a story about revenge. It's a story about restraint, about what happens when kindness is mistaken for weakness, and how two boys raised in silence prove that the strongest warriors are often the ones who never shout. By the end of this story, you might just see yourself in them, or someone you love, and maybe you'll walk into your own next room a little taller. If you've ever felt underestimated, stay with us. This story is for you. And as you listen, if something resonates, drop your thoughts in the comments. You never know who might need your words too. Subscribe for more true stories that honor quiet courage, silent strength, and everyday victories. Because sometimes the most powerful statement is a simple bow. Let's begin. It was a bright Saturday morning in early spring when Malcolm and Miles first stepped into the dojo. The sun was pouring through the high windows, casting long lines of light across the polished floor. The air smelled faintly of floor polish and old sweat familiar to those who trained here, but foreign to the two boys quietly removing their shoes at the entrance. They were identical from their braided hair to their careful, quiet movements. 10 years old, thin but strong, they moved like they were used to watching more than being watched. Their mother, a nurse who worked nights, stood behind them adjusting their borrowed white jais with hands that were gentle but tired. She gave each of them a quiet nod before stepping back toward the wall of parents. This was their first day at a new karate class in a new town, a small southern suburb where most kids grew up knowing one another, where differences weren't necessarily unwelcome, but they were noticed. Malcolm and Miles didn't say much as they entered the room. They bowed carefully at the threshold, the way their grandfather had taught them at home. No one else bowed back. In a room filled with sound, the thuds of feet, the snap of belts being tied, the occasional shout from the instructor, the twins' presence landed like a whisper. Most people didn't notice them, and the few who did, didn't quite welcome them. A group of older boys glanced over, smirked, and returned to their chatter. One nudged another with his elbow and whispered something behind a hand. It wasn't hostile, not yet, but it wasn't kind either. The instructor, a tall, clean-cut man with a black belt that had clearly seen years of wear, glanced at them, briefly nodded once, and called the class to attention. No welcome, no introduction, just line up. And just like that, the twins were part of something, but not really. They stood at the far edge of the line, slightly out of step, unsure where they fit. This wasn't new to them. They'd been the new kids before. They'd sat alone at lunch tables, walked home past kids who didn't wave back, answered questions in classrooms that fell into awkward silences. But here, where discipline, respect, and equality were supposed to be part of the culture, they felt the same invisible weight pressing down again. Being different had become something they carried like an extra belt around their waist. Not colored, not earned. Just there. And in places like this, being quiet, being black, being new, it didn't make you mysterious. It made you invisible. Across America, stories like Malcolm and Miles's happen every day, in gyms, classrooms, playgrounds, and clubs. Sometimes it's subtle, a missing smile, a name left off the list, a handshake that never comes. Other times it's more direct, unkind words, mockery, or cold exclusion wrapped in polite indifference. What hurts the most isn't being rejected. It's being overlooked, as if your presence doesn't shift the room at all. And that's what happened to the twins that day. They did every move. They followed every command. They bowed when told. But no one clapped for them. No one corrected them gently like they did with the other kids. No one said, "Good job, boys." But they weren't discouraged. Because what no one knew was this: they had been trained for silence. Not just in martial arts, but in life. Their grandfather, a quiet man who believed power should never be loud, once told them, "You don't have to be noticed to be present. You just have to be ready." And on that first day, even as they walked home without a single "see you next week" from the class, they were already preparing for the moment they would no longer be invisible. Because silence in the right hands can be a kind of strength. And some of the most powerful warriors are the ones who wait. That was the beginning. But what came next, the looks, the tests, the challenge that would force them to show who they really were, that began just a week later. And that's the part no one was ready for. At first it was subtle. During warm-ups when the students were supposed to pair up for stretches, Malcolm and Miles were always the last to be chosen. Sometimes no one chose them at all. The instructor would glance over, frown slightly, and say, "You two work together." It felt less like a solution, more like a confirmation. You don't belong with them. You belong with yourselves. During drills, the older boys, those with brown and black belts, moved with authority. Their stances were sharp, their voices loud. They were used to leading, and more importantly, they were used to being obeyed. It became clear quickly this dojo had a pecking order, not just based on skill or years of training, but on something else too. Seniority here wasn't just respected, it was wielded. One Tuesday evening during partner sparring, Malcolm was matched with a taller brown belt named Tyler. Tyler was strong, fast, and like many boys his age, eager to prove it. Malcolm held his ground, staying calm, applying the techniques he learned from his grandfather, centered, controlled, balanced. But Tyler didn't like that. He smirked after each block, pushing Malcolm harder, with every move using just enough force to make it uncomfortable, but not enough to be called out. Until at one point he swept Malcolm's feet too roughly. Malcolm hit the mat with a thud loud enough to turn heads. The room paused. The instructor looked over. Tyler bowed quickly. Malcolm got up silently. No reprimand, no correction, just a nod. "Back to your places." That was it. It wasn't just about discipline in that room. It was about who got to enforce it and who had to endure it. For the boys with the higher belts, discipline meant pride, leadership, status. For the twins, it meant obedience, silence, and knowing their place. And that imbalance wasn't just felt, it was enforced through routine, through tone, through who got to lead the warm-up and who always sat at the end of the line. The rules were the same for everyone, but the consequences weren't. Across America, in dojos, classrooms, locker rooms, this happens more often than people want to admit. The very systems built on fairness, on merit, on discipline, can quietly become tools of exclusion when no one watches closely enough. Not because the rules are wrong, but because the people using them forget the purpose behind them. Karate was never meant to be about domination. It was about self-control, mutual respect, inner peace. But when hierarchy goes unchecked, even good systems can start to resemble playgrounds for subtle cruelty. The twins never complained. Not when Miles was paired with a boy who accidentally elbowed him in the ribs too hard. Not when they were overlooked again and again for group demonstrations. Not even when Tyler, the same brown belt, once muttered under his breath as they passed, "You two don't belong in this class." They simply went home, bowed to their grandfather, and trained in their garage like nothing had happened. Because that's what they had been taught, to carry their dignity like a shield. To absorb disrespect without letting it become self-doubt. But something inside them, something quiet and strong, had begun to shift. There's only so many times a child can be pushed before stillness becomes steel. And on one particular day when the stares turned to jeers and the dojo forgot its own code of honor, that steel would show itself. Not through anger, not through shouting, but through precision, clarity, and the kind of power that doesn't need to prove itself to be felt. Because sometimes the most powerful lesson isn't in what you're taught, but in what you decide not to accept. And that decision was coming. Coach Dan had a reputation. In the small town of Ridgewood, he was known as a man of principle, disciplined, dependable, and deeply committed to the values of martial arts. His black belt, worn and faded at the edges, had been earned over decades. His name carried weight among local parents, and his dojo had trophies lined wall to wall. He wasn't the kind of man people questioned, and maybe that's why no one noticed when he stopped noticing. When Malcolm was knocked down during sparring, Coach Dan barely flinched. When Miles winced from an elbow jab, Dan didn't ask what happened. He simply said, "Keep your guard up." He wasn't cruel. He didn't yell. He didn't single anyone out. But that was the problem. He didn't see what was happening, or maybe he did, and chose not to intervene. The truth is, silence from authority figures often speaks louder than words, especially to kids. When someone with power looks away, it sends a message, intentional or not. This isn't serious. You're on your own. For Malcolm and Miles, Coach Dan's silence became a kind of background noise, predictable, steady, and painfully loud in its indifference. They watched as he gently corrected other students, applauded their efforts, encouraged their improvement. But with them, it was always do it again, faster. Don't overthink it. It wasn't abuse, but it wasn't support either. And in a setting like martial arts where hierarchy is part of the fabric, the absence of support can feel like a punishment in itself. This kind of behavior isn't unique to dojos. In classrooms across the country, teachers sometimes look away from bullying, especially when it's subtle or comes from good kids. In sports, coaches excuse aggressive players because that's how winners play. In offices, managers overlook exclusion because we don't want to stir things up. But here's the thing, authority isn't just about giving orders. It's about setting a tone. It's about protecting the quiet ones too, not just rewarding the loudest. Coach Dan likely thought he was being fair, that by treating everyone the same, he was upholding equality. But fairness isn't always sameness. Sometimes it's seeing who needs more support and giving it even when it's uncomfortable. There was one particular moment that stuck with Malcolm. It was after a class where Tyler had once again gone too far, pushing, taunting, jabbing with smug defiance. Malcolm had taken it, calmly, quietly. As they bowed at the end of class, Coach Dan walked past each student, offering a brief nod of acknowledgement. When he passed Malcolm and Miles, he paused just a beat longer than usual. Malcolm looked up, hoping for something. A word, a glance that said, "I saw that." But Coach Dan simply moved on. And in that tiny moment, Malcolm realized something many kids learn too soon. Sometimes the people who should protect you are too busy maintaining order to notice injustice. It was a painful realization, but it wasn't paralyzing because the twins had someone else guiding them, someone who saw what others missed, someone who had taught them that respect wasn't something you demanded, it was something you embodied, and that someone wasn't in the dojo. He was waiting for them at home. With a garage floor, 2 old punching bags, and a code of honor written in silence. That's where the real training happened. And that's where their story began to shift from endurance to readiness. Every afternoon after class, Malcolm and Miles never complained. No words of resentment were spoken on the way home. No gossip about classmates. Not once did they question their mother or grandfather about why everything felt so unfair. They simply took off their shoes, put down their backpacks, had a light meal, then stepped into the old garage behind the house. No full-length mirror, no professional mats, just a concrete floor, an old punching bag hanging in the corner, and a man silently waiting their grandfather. His name was Mr. Harlan Rhodes, a former Marine who had served overseas in the 1980s and also a multiple-time state-level karate champion in his youth. No certificates on the wall, no frame photos of medals, but his eyes, deep, calm, steady, always looked as if they were listening to something the world had missed. He didn't teach them to win. He taught them how to control. Power, he once said in a hoarse, gentle voice, isn't in the strike. It's in the choice not to strike. When they were very young, he didn't teach them their first punch. He taught them how to stand upright, how to breathe evenly, how to observe before acting, and most importantly, how to endure without losing oneself. While their peers were learning high kicks and loud shouts, he taught Malcolm and Miles how to take a step back instead of reacting too soon. While other children were praised for how fast they could kick, he remained silent and only nodded when he saw his grandsons maintain steady breathing after 5 minutes of shadowboxing. He never needed to raise his voice, because he knew real strength never needs to prove itself. Many times their mother asked why he didn't enroll them in a martial arts school earlier. He simply replied, "They don't need a stage yet, they need to understand the arena is within." And now as those 2 boys faced looks of disdain, reckless hits, and the silence of adults in formal classrooms, it's that very cement floor in the old garage that has become their strongest training ground. No one at the dojo knows this. No one would guess that the 2 quiet boys who bow silently before every session once trained with a man who had faced life and death, a man whose discipline came not from textbooks, but from the battlefield. And because they were raised in silence, they also learned how to be heard without needing to shout. It wasn't just a skill, it was a legacy. In a world where talent is often measured by noise, sometimes what sets you apart is the ability to stand tall in silence. And that legacy, unknown to anyone in the dojo, continues to build quietly day by day, training by training, glance after overlooked glance, waiting for the right moment. Because as Mr. Harlan often said after each session, just because they don't see it doesn't mean you're not ready. And the day they saw it, the day the whole class could no longer look away, eventually came. And it started as big things often do, with a comment that seemed harmless, with a match no one paid attention to. Only this time, the one being challenged was more ready than ever. It started with a joke. One of those jokes that's meant to sting, but dressed just enough in humor to slip under the radar. Tyler, the brown belt, who always seemed to walk a step ahead of everyone, leaned over during warm-ups and whispered loud enough for others to hear, careful sparring with those two. They probably learned their moves dodging bullets in the hood. A few of the older students chuckled. Not all of them understood the reference, but they knew it was meant to mock. Malcolm heard it. Miles heard it. And most painfully so did Coach Dan. He looked up, hesitated, then looked away. No correction, no call out. Just more stretches, more silence. For Malcolm and Miles, it wasn't the first time, but it was the first time it happened in front of everyone, openly, publicly, and without consequence. Something shifted in that moment. It wasn't rage. It wasn't fear. It was clarity. They had been taught to wait, to observe, to stay grounded. But their grandfather also taught them another lesson, one he rarely said out loud, but lived every day. There is a line, and when it's crossed, standing still becomes standing down. That Saturday, Coach Dan announced an open sparring session. Anyone could challenge anyone within reason. It was meant to encourage healthy competition, respect control. Tyler predictably stepped forward first. "Let's make it interesting," he said with a grin, eyes darting toward the twins. "How about a 2-on-1? Laughter rippled through the room. Coach Dan frowned slightly. "This isn't a game. Pick one partner." But Malcolm had already stepped forward. Miles joined without a word. They bowed deeply properly, eyes steady, no anger, no fear, just focus. Tyler smirked, cracked his knuckles, and took his stance. What followed wasn't flashy. There were no flying kicks or loud shouts, no taunting, no retaliation, just movement calculated, controlled, and quiet. Tyler struck first fast, hard, wild, but Malcolm parried cleanly, redirecting the force with a twist of the wrist. Miles followed with a smooth counter, measured, intentional, restrained. Within seconds, Tyler was off balance. Not hurt, not humiliated, just stopped. And for the first time since the twins had joined the class, the dojo was completely silent. Even Coach Dan didn't speak. There was no clapping, no cheering, just the sound of realization settling over the room like dust. Respect hadn't been taken by force. It had been restored through controlled discipline and grace under pressure. And everyone knew it. What Tyler had intended as a show of dominance had turned into a lesson, one that didn't need to be shouted to be heard. In that moment, the roles shifted. Malcolm and Miles were no longer the quiet kids. They were something else now, something undeniable. Because true respect isn't demanded. It's earned, often in the most unexpected ways. Later that day, as the students packed up and filed out, a few of the same boys who had laughed earlier stopped to nod at the twins. Not much, but enough. It was the beginning of something, and yet the real reckoning hadn't come from the students. It was still waiting just beyond the mats in the eyes of the man who had watched it all happen and said nothing. Coach Dan. The twins didn't need his approval, but the dojo did. Because when authority looks away, it doesn't just weaken the victim, it corrupts the room. And what happened next would reveal just how deeply that silence had shaped everyone watching. In the days following the sparring match, something changed, not in a loud, dramatic way, but in the small things, the kind that speak even louder than applause. The smirks from other students stopped. The sideways glances turned into quick nods. And Tyler. He didn't say much after that. He didn't need to. He had learned something that day. Everyone had. And yet the most remarkable thing wasn't the victory itself. It was how Malcolm and Miles handled it. They didn't gloat. They didn't seek attention or demand apologies. They simply bowed, helped Tyler to his feet, and thanked him for the match. It caught everyone off guard. In a culture where so much of power is expressed through dominance, through winning loudly, what the twins did was radical in its quietness. They responded to mockery not with revenge, but with respect. They countered force not with fury, but with control. And in doing so, they turned every assumption about them, about where they came from, about what they were capable of on its head. That was the moment people began to really see them. Because strength, when paired with humility, has a way of making people pay attention. One parent approached their mother after class that week. "I didn't know your boys had been training before," she said gently. Their mother smiled. "They've been training since they were 5, just not where people could see." The truth is, some of the most powerful transformations happen in silence. Not every explosion shakes the ground. Some just change the way people look at you. And for Coach Dan, the way he looked at the twins had begun to shift too. During the next class, he invited Malcolm to demonstrate a basic blocking sequence in front of the group. It was a small gesture, but one that said, "I see you." Not long after, Miles was asked to lead a warm-up with another student. Again, no announcement, no fanfare, just quiet validation. But perhaps the most telling moment came when Coach Dan paused after class one evening and said almost under his breath, "Good form today." Just 4 words. But from a man who built a dojo on discipline and distance, it felt like an olive branch. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't enough to rewrite what had been overlooked. But it was a beginning. Because power isn't just about who throws the strongest punch. It's about who has the strength to stay centered when the world tries to pull you off balance. It's about the ability to turn pain into disciplined mockery, into motivation, and silence into space for growth. The twins had done all of that, not through rebellion, but through stillness. Not by fighting against the system, but by standing within it with dignity. And sometimes that kind of power is more revolutionary than any shout or strike. Still, not everyone welcomed the change. As the twins quietly began to rise in respect among their peers, whispers started among a different crowd, parents who had expected their sons to lead, and now watched as those roles shifted. Some of them weren't ready to see power in the hands of boys who had never demanded it, and what unfolded next wasn't a fight on the mats, but something much quieter and far more telling about how adults handle the humility of being wrong. It happened slowly, like sunlight creeping into a room that had been dim for too long. The dojo, once ruled by quiet hierarchies and unspoken favoritism, began to shift. Not because of a speech, not because of confrontation, but because 2 boys who had every right to be angry chose instead to be present. And presence, when steady enough, can change a room more than protest ever could. Coach Dan started to notice it first. He began adjusting the pairings for sparring, making sure challenges were rotated more fairly. He called on students who had long been overlooked. And for the first time in months, he began each class by reminding everyone why they were here, not just to master forms, but to master themselves. But the deeper change came from the sidelines. A few parents who had once chuckled at Tyler's confidence now watched him with unease. They noticed how quiet he had become during class, how often he looked at the twins, not with anger, but with something more complicated, maybe even admiration. And then there were the other parents. One father, who had never spoken to Malcolm and Miles's mother, walked over after class and said, "I didn't realize your boys were that disciplined. They're impressive." She smiled politely but didn't say much, because she didn't need to. For once, her sons were speaking loud enough without raising their voices. A few families weren't as gracious. 2 parents pulled their children from the dojo, quietly citing scheduling issues, though it was clear the real reason had more to do with ego than logistics. Their sons had lost sparring matches to the quiet twins, and some people simply weren't ready to see their children challenged, especially by kids they once saw as outsiders. But that's the thing about true humility. It doesn't demand applause. It simply waits for the right people to notice. The dojo itself felt different now. There was less swagger, more eye contact. The warm-ups were quieter, more focused. Even Tyler, once the loudest in the room, had begun training with something new in his stance: restraint. One afternoon, he asked Miles if they could run drills together. No sarcasm, no smirk, just a simple question. Miles nodded, and they did. That quiet exchange said more than any apology could. Because when a community is forced to look in the mirror, it doesn't always like what it sees. But the ones willing to stay in the room to wrestle with that reflection are the ones who grow. And this dojo, in its own slow, imperfect way, was starting to grow. Not because someone forced it to, but because two boys gave it permission by showing what strength could look like when wrapped in stillness. By showing what leadership looked like when it didn't ask to be followed. By simply being who they were consistently, unapologetically, and without resentment. And that kind of leadership, it doesn't stop at the edge of the mat. Because outside those dojo walls, a different kind of invitation was waiting. One that had nothing to do with rank or belt color and everything to do with legacy. By the start of summer, the dojo had changed, but Malcolm and Miles had changed even more. They still arrived early, still bowed at the door, still stayed late to help put away the mats even when no one asked them to. But something about their presence now felt different. They were no longer navigating the room quietly. Now the room moved around them. And one afternoon, Coach Dan asked a question that would mark the next turning point. Would you two be open to helping with the beginner class next month? The twins looked at each other. Malcolm spoke first. Only if we can work with the kids who are shy, the ones who hang in the back. Dan blinked just for a second, then smiled. You got it. That's how it started. Every Saturday morning, a group of younger students, some anxious, some with learning differences, some who had been too nervous to join regular class, would gather in the far corner of the dojo. And leading them were two boys who knew exactly what it felt like to be overlooked. Malcolm knelt beside a boy who flinched every time someone raised a hand too quickly. Miles practiced slow breathing techniques with a girl who had trouble making eye contact. No pressure, no shouting, just steady presence. And little by little, those kids began to bloom. Because when your teacher doesn't just instruct, but understands, something special happens. Malcolm and Miles didn't just teach moves. They modeled composure. They taught what it meant to take up space gently, to lead without commanding, to be seen without having to demand attention. And the younger students, especially the ones who had felt too different or too awkward for a typical class, responded in ways no one expected. One boy, Evan, who hadn't spoken aloud in his first 2 weeks, stood up at the end of a session and said clearly, "Can I come back next Saturday?" It wasn't a big moment, but it was everything. Sometimes leadership doesn't look like giving orders or standing in front. Sometimes it looks like crouching to eye level, listening more than speaking, and letting someone else shine first. That's the kind of leadership Malcolm and Miles learned not from a book, but from being silenced and choosing not to stay that way. Their pain hadn't hardened them. It had humbled them, shaped them into the kind of role models they never had. The kind who lead not because they want to, but because they know what it feels like when no one else will. And though they never talked about it out loud, the dojo had started calling their little corner the quiet class. Not in mockery, but in respect. Because by then everyone understood what quiet really meant when it came to those two. It meant centered, it meant patient, it meant unshakable. But even as they stepped into these new roles, there was a question they carried quietly. What happens when your story becomes bigger than just you? Because beyond the mats, beyond the dojo, the world was watching in its own silent way. And soon, that silence would be broken. For most people, when they hear the word injustice, they think big. They picture courtrooms, protests, breaking news headlines. They think of loud voices, raised fists, massive change. But the truth, injustice often starts in quiet rooms, in playgrounds, in classrooms, in dojos, in small moments when someone looks away, or laughs when they shouldn't, or chooses not to speak up because it's just a joke, or just how kids are. That's why stories like Malcolm and Miles's matter, because they remind us that not all harm is loud, and not all resistance has to be either. What they experienced wasn't unique. Across the country, children of color walk into spaces meant to uplift them and feel smaller. Not because of open hostility, but because of subtle exclusion. Because of microaggressions wrapped in tradition. Because someone assumes they can't lead or won't excel or simply don't fit in. A 2022 study found that Black students in American public schools are 3 times more likely to be disciplined for the same behavior as white students. In sports programs, they're often labeled too aggressive or too intense, while others showing the same drive are praised as natural leaders. These are not statistics, they're real children, Children who begin to question their worth before they've even learned to spell the word confidence. And the most heartbreaking part, many of them stay silent. Because silence becomes a survival strategy. Because they think maybe if I stay quiet, I won't get in trouble. Maybe if I don't speak up, they'll leave me alone. But Malcolm and Miles flipped that script. They showed that silence can also be a strategy of strength, a place of reflection, a space for clarity, a foundation not of fear, but of focus. Their story reminds us that quiet doesn't always mean weak, and loud isn't always right. It reminds us that small acts holding your ground, helping a teammate up, showing up again and again with grace, can shift entire environments. And that change doesn't always come from those in charge. Sometimes it begins with the ones no one expected to lead, the ones who watched, who waited, who trained quietly even when no one clapped for them. When we tell stories like this, not just of injustice, but of resilience in the face of it, we invite others to look more closely at their own lives, to ask, who have I overlooked? When have I stayed silent when I should have spoken? And who might be waiting to be seen? Because injustice doesn't need shouting to be challenged. It just needs truth, told clearly, lived consistently. And if two boys in borrowed GIs on the edge of a sparring mat can change the atmosphere of an entire dojo, what could you change right where you are? That's the power of stories like this. They don't just move us, they call us. And as for Malcolm and Miles, their journey wasn't just about reclaiming space in one martial arts class. It was about proving something deeper, that even in a world slow to welcome them, they could still leave behind a legacy no one could ignore. The last time Malcolm and Miles bowed at the dojo that summer, something felt different. Not because it was dramatic. There were no certificates handed out, no formal announcements. Just another class, another ending, another quiet moment of tradition. But as they bowed, the room bowed with them. Not just in body, but in spirit. Respect had returned, and this time it wasn't rooted in hierarchy or belt color. It came from something deeper: recognition. It's easy to look at these two boys now and see strength. It's easy to see poised presence, even leadership. But rewind just a few months, and they were the outsiders, the kids no one noticed, the ones people whispered about. They were overlooked, underestimated, ignored. And yet here they stood, not with their fists clenched, but with their heads held high. Not because they shouted for respect, but because they earned it in the quietest way possible. That's the heart of this story. Because maybe you've felt small too. Maybe you've walked into rooms where no one welcomed you. Maybe you've been talked over, left out, or told through glances and silence that you didn't belong. And maybe, like Malcolm and Miles, you've wondered if staying kind is even worth it. But here's the truth. Kindness is not weakness. Stillness is not surrender. And feeling invisible does not mean you lack value. Sometimes the people who feel the smallest are simply the ones carrying the deepest strength, waiting for the right moment to rise. You don't need a belt to prove your worth. You don't need a title to make an impact. All you need is the courage to keep showing up, to hold your ground, to stay true to who you are even when the room doesn't yet recognize it. Because the world will try to measure you by your volume, your speed, your status. But your quiet consistency, that's where the real power is. And when your moment comes, when someone challenges you, underestimates you, or tries to shrink your light, you won't have to shout. You'll just have to stand. That will be enough. So if you're feeling small today, maybe you're not small at all. Maybe you're the warrior in disguise. And the world, it's just now starting to notice. Have you ever been underestimated, overlooked, or told you don't belong? Share your story in the comments. We see you. We hear you. Subscribe for more stories that shine a light on the quiet heroes among us. And if this moved, you pass it on. Someone else might need this reminder today.